Welcome back, folks, and on to our reading on political communication. And here are our learning outcomes for the week. We'll define fourth estate. We'll identify dominant trends in the media today. We'll discuss the impact of the internet and social media on political communications. And we'll outline and discuss the four main types of media effects: reinforcement, agenda setting, framing, and priming. Some key terms for this week. The term political communication encompasses all the means by which political information is produced and disseminated, and the influence it has in the political process. Political communication is obviously particularly important in democracies where, citizens and decision makers are dependent on good information. When you hear the term the fourth estate, this is used to describe the role that journalists plays and the news media plays as a whole, almost like an additional branch of government. It's that important. Mass media, of course, is all those different forms of media that allow the communicator to reach a large number of people. That could be newspapers, which was the first form of mass media, and then, of course, television, radio, the internet today. It may be obvious to you, but media is relatively new in terms of human history, and mass media is even newer. We don't start to have the wide distribution of newspapers until the late 18th century. So we go from writing, of course, on a small scale, on a person-to-person scale, to today's social media. And there's been obviously a great deal of evolution and scope and reach during that period of time. Just as important as the ability to reach a lot of people through media is the ability to understand that media. So mass literacy is critical when it comes to the evolution of the media. This was first achieved in the West, in Western Europe. Sweden was the first to achieve 80% literacy by the end of the 18th century. So this increase in literacy, the birth of the newspaper as the first mass media in the late 18th century, these are really critical to political developments, because it's no coincidence that you see the French Revolution, the American Revolution, in the late 1700s, at a time where people are much more broadly literate and much more able to get a hold of newspapers and pamphlets and other forms of media to share political ideas. And in those cases, it was ideas about the Enlightenment and the relationship between government and the governed, and who should be running the show. These were very important things to the revolutionary movements of the late 1700s. And then, of course, as we go into the 20th century, big step into the 20th century, the dominance of first radio, the golden age of radio, we move into television in the 50s and 60s, and that starts to overtake newspapers as the major form of news that people are getting. And then more recently, really over only the last 20 or 25 years, the transition to internet, and even more recently, the last 5 to 10 years, social media, as how so much political information and media and entertainment get disseminated. This figure from your text goes over what I just spoke about in general terms. So make sure that you understand the history of the mass media, the evolution of the mass media. Questions may arise in this week's quiz or the final exam. So just be aware of that and spend a little bit of extra time studying that. The impact of the digital age, the internet, has been, incredible when it comes to political communication. It's hard to believe that, really the internet only starts to become widely used, or at least somewhat used, during the 1990s, late 1990s. And then, of course, here we are, 25 years later, and it's dramatically impacting our politics, our elections. Make sure that you're understanding some of these concepts and their political influence. One downside of the modern digital age, and particularly social media, is that we often find ourselves in echo chambers. These are kind of close-knit communities where we essentially tell each other how right we are. So very conservative people will come together in online communities, very liberal people. They share Facebook feeds, they're getting very similar information, and they end up living having very different ideas about reality and news. Now, this has changed quite a bit. If you were to go back even to the 1970s and 80s and even into the 90s, most Americans were getting their news from one of three network sources: ABC, NBC, CBS. They were reading their local newspaper, and those were sort of the major news sources. So a person and their neighbor were essentially getting the same information and having discussions about that shared information. We don't have that when we're in our own little echo chambers. So, the role of the internet, the role of social media really is a mixed bag. There's a lot of problems that are associated with it. This gets into the other concept that's here, this idea of post-truth, that the fact that to many people, emotions and personal beliefs are more important than, or more influential in shaping their attitudes than objective facts. This is particularly problematic. We saw this in the last election cycle where, there just wasn't a shared understanding of basic verifiable facts. And so that's our job as folks studying political science, is that, in some situations, things are purely of a matter of opinion and preference. And in others, things are verifiable. We can tell if, for example, there is widespread fraud in election or not. And those things can be investigated. And for example, in the United States, we have very clean elections, and we have processes to make sure that votes are counted correctly, and that those tallies are checked, double checked. There's an audit after a vote where, they go back over those systems. And then in the occasion of a very close election, then most states in the United States mandate recounts. So, we can really tell who won an election. Now, of course, you take a look at the United States during the year 2000, there was an extremely close election. It came down to Florida between Vice President Gore and then Governor Bush. That came down to a few hundred votes in a highly flawed state election that occurred in Florida. But that was an unusual situation. And so the reason why I bring this up is we ended up having a discussion after the 2020 election, right? That, was there widespread fraud or not? Well, this is something that we can verify, and we know that there was not. But there's a lot of people that feel that there was, despite a lack of evidence in that situation. You're probably all familiar with the roles that internet trolls and bots play when it comes to political communication and influencing potential public opinion. This seemed to be a bigger issue in the 2016 election, particularly when it seemed like there was a greater involvement of Russia in the 2016 election in the United States. Media influences attitudes in four key ways. First of all, there's a reinforcement mechanism where all people tend to do this. They tend to seek out opinions that reinforce their existing views. People want to be told how right they already are. So people who are more liberal will go to liberal media sources. People who are more conservative might go to conservative media sources. It's one of the reasons why I encourage you to look at a diversity of reputable sources. Now, that doesn't mean that, all of these sources are necessarily equal. Some have, much higher reporting standards than others. And of course, we can verify certain facts, and then some information is lacking evidence. And so that's our job as sophisticated consumers of the media to get out of this. But it's important to recognize that we all fall into this reinforcement trap. And that, again, it's closely related to the concept of the echo chamber, and social media is set up in a way that really strengthens and reinforces opinions. This was less so the case in the past when we were all we all had exposure to the same newspaper or the same nightly news, and so we didn't tend to see our opinions diverge as much as they do today. The media has an important role in agenda setting. Certainly prominent individuals have this power too. Anytime the president steps before a microphone, the things that the president of the United States talk about go on the national agenda. People start to talk about what the president had to say on those issues. So the president has power, and other leaders elsewhere. But media outlets, prominent journalists, they also have this power. What stories do they decide to do? What stories do they not decide to do? Do they focus on the environment? Do they focus on crime? All of these things will determine what we see as public problems and issues. Now, it's not as if they're just deciding these things randomly. In many cases, we end up with a crisis that demands national or international attention. There'll be some major problem. It could be a form of violence, or it could be something as simple as an election coming up. It could be a volcano erupting. That's obviously going to draw a lot of news coverage. But in other situations, whether or not we focus on education, whether or not we focus on crime, whether or not we focus on the economy, this is where the media really draws its power. And then once the media has decided, a media outlet has decided to focus on an issue, how do they frame that issue? If they're looking at a war overseas, are they focused on violence? Are they focused on, if the United States is involved, are they focused on perhaps the United States rebuilding a school? If the United States is involved in a humanitarian mission, are we focused on, do the images show, the distribution of food and medicine and so forth? Or do the images focus on something much uglier? A good example of this was the war in Vietnam, which was the first time where news coverage permitted and allowed cameras sort of in the battlefield in the war in Vietnam. And when people read the stories, they read the print stories about the war in Vietnam, there was fairly widespread support in the United States for the war effort. But once the cameras were on the ground filming what it was like in the trenches, what it was like in the battlefield, what it was like in the jungle, on a platoon by platoon basis in fighting the Vietnam War, public attitude started to shift dramatically when those images got home. So how that conflict was framed really impacted overall public support of American public support for the war in Vietnam. And then the last key media influence is the role of priming. So, how the media interprets events could go very well beyond a particular story. So if there's a great deal of individual crime coverage at the local level, there may be a greater support for law and order candidates at the federal level, at the national level. What are we covering? And an important thing too is, if you're taking a look at a news story that's covering something that's particularly violent, it's always important to ask yourself, is this an example of what's happening out there every day, or is this an exception to the rule, right? So in many cases, media will cover something exceptional, something unusual, but sometimes we might see that violence and say, oh, it's always like that in Minneapolis, it's always like that in St. Paul. So that's an important job for reputable journalists to differentiate the two, right? They might say, well, this terrible thing occurred in Minneapolis, but by the way, overall violent crime is down this year in Minneapolis. Or they might say, this terrible thing occurred, and this is an example of the rising crime that we're seeing in Minneapolis. So I think some of the strongest journalism is those that put a story into a broader context. Is this an example of what's going on, or is this an exception, and we're seeing, and our communities are safer than we might think? And so media can serve this function sometimes in leading us to believe that we're in a more dangerous environment than we actually are. And so we as consumers of it have to ask ourselves, is this a reflection of what's going on, or is this an exception to what's going on? Some important trends to think about when it comes to political communication. The first is commercialization. We see much less not-for-profit broadcasting, public broadcasting. Most of our media sources, particularly in the United States, are for-profit. Yeah, we have NPR, we have public TV, but most of our media sources are for profit, and they make their money based on advertising, based on ratings. And so they're going to tend to be more sensational. They want to grab viewers. And one of the things that grabs viewers is sometimes things that are scarier, sometimes things that are more conflictual. It's for that reason that if you listen to public radio or you listen to public TV, it's not quite as exciting as if you're listening to CNN or Fox or whatever. It's their job to kind of pull you in. And sometimes they pull you in with dramatic and then sometimes focusing on dangerous or violent aspects of media. And it's just something we have to keep in mind, that it is their number one job down at CNN or down at Fox or down at MSNBC is to turn a profit. They have to make money. It used to be that the news outlets, even in major networks, they weren't expected to make money. They made their money off of the TV shows. They made their money off of I Love Lucy and or whatever. And the nightly news was a form of public service. And then beginning in the late 70s and early 80s, they figured out with extremely good shows, but also extremely profitable shows like Frontline, like 60 Minutes, they started to make a lot of money. And so, they were expanded. And then organizations like Fox and CNN and others realized there was a great deal of money to be made in this area. Media is much more fragmented as well. It's becoming more so. Which means, and this gets back to our comment or our discussion before about echo chambers and reinforcement. We now have very liberal news stations, cable, satellite stations. We have very conservative ones. And people look to those sources that reinforce their existing views. And we also see this obviously online, and we see this when it comes to social media. Our media is also much more globalized. They are part of, global corporations, many of which own many media organizations like News Corp. The Fox News Corp owns, many things like Fox News. It owns the Wall Street Journal. It owns the Times of London and so forth. So there's sort of a globalization when it comes to ownership of media. And then also media is instantly transmitted around the world and not equally in all directions. So you take a look at these media hubs, and the United States is the foremost media hub in the world. The United States is just distributing media all over the world, of course, with channels like CNN and news, but also entertainment media and other forms. And it's for that reason that some countries feel almost overwhelmed by American media. If you find yourself in a movie theater in Japan, most of those movies are going to be American movies. If you find yourself in a movie theater in much of Europe or Central or South America, likewise, many of the news sources that people see are coming from either the United States or Western Europe, or perhaps prominent states in the Middle East or Russia. So these areas are distributing media. Some places around the world are consuming American media. We're not consuming their media, and that leads in some situations to sort of a one-way street when it comes to information. And then also in many cases, American media isn't always a great reflection of what it's like in the United States, right? Whether that be entertainment media, whether that be news media. In many cases, it might paint the United States as more conflictual, more violent, more problematic that it may be. So these are just things to think about that are related to media globalization. And then another important trend is the interaction component of modern social media and the use of Twitter, the use of Facebook, and they're starting to have a real and measurable impact on political uprising, non-traditional forms of political participation. People can organize more quickly. We saw this, one of the earliest forms we saw this was in the Arab Spring and the rise up against authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, and the ability for people to organize entirely online in real time. And of course, there's a real effort by authoritarian leaders to limit this. You see this in China, you see this in Russia, because they realize that the ability of people to interact and to create social movements that are outside traditional communication channels is potentially a threat to their authority. Media freedom is critical to the overall strength of the democracy. And in authoritarian regimes, there's obviously a much greater effort to control the media. They do this through greater controls on the internet. They do this through licensing media outlets and not providing a license if they're too critical of the government. They may do this through government funding. Russia is an example of this. The cable news organization RT, I think it's RT, is distributing internationally, and it's heavily funded by the government there in Russia. We see this, of course, in many Middle Eastern states. If you're in North Korea and if you're watching the TV, everything that's on the TV is government propaganda. It is produced by the government. So that would be obviously an extreme version of that. Okay, to wrap things up, the free flow of political information is a key difference between democracies and authoritarian regimes. The impact of the internet and social media on political communication is massive. We're still studying it. It's not fully understood. But we've seen in the last couple of election cycles, particularly in the United States and elsewhere in the world, that it's influencing politics in ways that are difficult to predict. The internet's made more political information available, so that's good. More people have access to news, more people have access to information, but it also creates these problems we've talked about. The echo chamber, which contributes to reinforcement, and fake news, completely fabricated news, and the idea that people are making decisions based on information that they like versus information that they can verify. Make sure in reviewing for the quiz this week, it's very important that you understand the 4 classes of media effects: reinforcement, agenda setting, framing, and priming. And also consider how new media, how the internet is changing and influencing these media effects. And then also consider the trends that we see globally. We see increasingly commercial media. We see extremely fragmented media where people are going to those sources that reinforce their existing views. Our media is global in nature, but we're not sharing information equally. So, the United States is distributing a lot of media, but we're not receiving as much media. And that's limiting our understanding. And in some parts of the world, they feel perhaps inundated by American media. And then, of course, social media and the internet is much more interactive. It's much more real time. And that's shaping not only political communication, but the ability to organize, to protest, and in some cases to rise up against governments and authoritarian regimes in real time and communicate outside of mechanisms that the government can control. And here are your guiding questions for this week. As with previous weeks, 1 substantial original post, at least 2 responses to the on-topic posts of your classmates. We are wrapping things up. Your weekly participation grade your overall participation grade is a big chunk of your overall grade. And for most students who participate throughout the semester, they get a nice boost when it comes to their final grade. So finish strong, draw an assigned reading and making your point. When you're responding to classmates, make sure that you're moving that conversation forward, that you're adding something. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to me during Zoom office hours, shoot me an email, whatever you need. Have a fantastic week, and I will see you next time.